Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. And I would like to thank the faculty for organizing this event so that people can share different research interests. So my research is about children with developmental disorders, and specifically I study the brain to understand the brain mechanisms underlying different kind of conditions, but also I want to understand, how the brain responds to intervention in order to understand neuroplasticity. Okay, thank you. Okay. So first of all, developmental disorders. What is developmental disorder? So basically, it's a condition that happens in children. So these children are born with it. So it's something innate without known causes yet. So we are not clear what causes those different conditions for now. And it's highly heritable. So it runs in families. And there are definitely neurological differences associated with different kinds of disorders, but it's not like a causal kind of relationships yet. So we cannot say, the brain differences cause the condition. It's a complicated picture because the brain is super plastic, and the brain differences could be due to different experiences. So we don't know whether, the brain difference is causes or it's just a result of the developmental disorder yet. And there are more males than females affected, almost 4 times more males than females. And there's comorbidity, so that means they co-occur. For example, children with ASD always, sometimes also show language delay or attentional disability. And so far, the diagnosis and treatments are both at the behavioral level yet. So we don't have a blood test for ASD. So everything has to be based on the behavior. Until they show the behavior, we are able to diagnose it. And also the treatment is based on behavioral intervention. So that's why psychologists are playing a pretty important role in children with developmental disorders. There are also huge individual differences within a diagnosis. So these are some examples. For example, ASD, ADHD, specific language impairment, developmental dyslexia. So for my specific research, I focus on ASD and developmental dyslexia. So I will be talking about one project for each population today. So for developmental dyslexia, which means reading difficulty. So these are like smart kids, but they can't learn to read. So we try to understand what's going on in the brain and how we develop some effective interventions for them. So for now, what I'm doing right now for the developmental dyslexia project is reading intervention study. So we had intervention for children with reading disability, and we scan their brain before and after intervention to see how the brain responds to our intervention and whether it's effective or not. And then for ASD, we had several projects, but today what I want to talk about is a figurative language comprehension study for adolescents with ASD. So these are high-functioning ASD adolescents, but still they show language comprehension difficulty. So we developed figurative language comprehension program. So we want to see how it helps. We collected evidence from the behavioral level as well as the neurological level.
Could you at this point spell AHD and ASD, because some of us may not be able to.
Sure, yeah.
Statistics, something that
Yeah. ASD is autism spectrum disorder. So previously we have autism, we have Asperger's, but right now everything is called ASD because it's a spectrum. So Asperger's is a kind of a high-functioning ASD, but now we don't have Asperger's anymore, so everything is called ASD. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, so now I'm going to move on to my first study that I want to talk about today. So this is a behavioral intervention study for Chinese children with developmental dyslexia. So again, it's reading difficulty. So these are Chinese children, 5th grade Chinese children with reading difficulty. We had 3 groups of them. Each group is about 20. We have 20 participants in each group. So they're all children with developmental dyslexia. We assigned them to 3 intervention conditions. One is phonological intervention, and one is morphological intervention, one is a weighting control group. So the reason that we had phonological and morphological intervention is because phonological intervention is like the gold standard for alphabetic languages. So that's the mainstream in reading intervention in English, in Spanish, and German. But you know, Chinese is different, right? Chinese is not alphabetic. Maybe phonological intervention is not the most effective intervention for our children. So we developed morphological intervention to specifically address Chinese features, and we want to compare the effectiveness of these 2 different interventions. And then we have a weighting control group as a blank control. So we did pre and post intervention MRI scan, as well as behavioral assessment. So this intervention was 8 weeks with 5 days per week and 1 hour per day. So we did it online. So originally we wanted to do it face-to-face, but then there's COVID, so we had to do it online. But it turned out fine, so yeah. So we see the effectiveness on the behavioral assessments. So these are different behavioral tests, like reading tests. So reading fluency, reading character naming, there are some phonological skills and morphological skills. So we saw the improvement in the phonological intervention and the morphological intervention groups than the weighting control. So both interventions are effective in terms of improving reading fluency and the character naming. But then for the phonological skill, the phonological intervention group had a significant effect than the other 2 groups. So morphological intervention is not helping and is not helpful for improving phonological skills. But for the morphological skills, we see the effectiveness for the morphological intervention, but not the phonological intervention here. So in other words, both interventions are helpful in improving reading, but phonological intervention improves phonological skills, and the morphological intervention also improved morphological skills. So these are just behavioral improvements. So they can read better, they can read faster, but how about the brain? So both effects are, both interventions are effective in terms of the behavioral measures. But in the brain, actually we found specific effects. So they have their own brain regions that are responsive to the different interventions. So for this study, we looked at cortical thickening, how thick the cortical areas are. So we found for the phonological intervention, the right middle temporal cortex right here in the red color showed a significant increase for the cortical thickness. So greater thickening in the phonological condition than the other 2 groups, than the morphological intervention group or the weighting control group. So this is considered, specific effect for the for the phonological intervention. And then different regions, these regions are showing increased cortical thickening after the morphological intervention, but not the other two groups. So again, we found different parts of the brain responds to different interventions, even though behaviorally they both are effective. But in the brain, different regions are showing changes. And then so that's the cortical thickness. That's basically the gray matter of the brain. And we also looked at the white matter, and we also found, here this indicates the region where we found a significant effect. So this is a white matter, which is a fiber tract that connects different parts of the brain. So these are the important language areas in the brain. And we found the fiber tract for this segment of fiber tract showed a significant increase following the phonological intervention, which is the red line here, but not the other two groups. So again, it indicates specific effects following the phonological intervention. So that's one study. I don't know how much time I have. Okay, all right. Yeah, so I hope you already have some idea about what I do. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.